Labour Member of Parliament. I was elected to Parliament in 2005, and I'm one of only 3 vegan MPs in Parliament. I was actually the only vegan MP until 2010, and then I had 2 Labour colleagues, Cathy Jameson and Chris Williamson, were elected as well, so we've got this little mini vegan caucus in Parliament. I'm a patron of the Vegan Society. I'm the Vice President, I think it's called the League Against Cruel Sport. So I work with those organisations on vegan issues, but also a lot of other animal welfare charities and just various other things that I do on my own accord. So I've been asked today to just talk about some of the issues that have been going on in Parliament in the last year, and just flagging up some of the issues that you might be interested in campaigning on, lobbying your MP about, or just that you might be interested in for your own reasons. Like I said, I've done a few very specifically vegan things in Parliament. We had a World Vegan Day debate for the first time 3 years ago, which was just a half an hour German debate at the end of the day. Since then, we've always tried, I think World Vegan Day is coming up November the 1st. So we always try and do a little event in Parliament with the Vegan Society, trying to get the House of Commons caterers to provide vegan meals. We had this cupcake Cull the first year we did it, and she was giving out, I think we had about 80 free cupcakes, and the idea was that people would come and get a cupcake and learn about veganism. And we were absolutely swamped, like within the first 5 minutes, there were all these parliamentary researchers that are grabbing the cupcakes and then pretending they were very interested in converting to veganism. But I think quite a lot of their bosses had sent them to grab the cupcake and run. But it's just a good way of flagging things up and making people aware that vegans exist and that we're relatively normal. I wouldn't say completely normal, relatively normal. So in terms of the parliamentary agenda, I think over the last couple of years, what we've actually seen on the political main stage is much more of a willingness, particularly on the part of the left, to take on vested interests. So you've seen the whole Murdoch empire collapse, and the lefts are reporting to the power of the press. You've seen the Public Accounts Committee under Margaret Hodges' chairmanship really challenge some of the big companies like Vodafone and Amazon and Google for not paying tax in this country. Edmund Lavant at Labour Party conference a couple of weeks ago was talking about the big 6 energy companies and how they've totally fixed the energy market, so they're paying themselves huge dividends, huge bonuses, and yet fuel prices and people's household bills are going through the roof. And where I think that we haven't quite got, but where I think the next people in our sights, if you like, are the farming industry and the food industry that really go unchallenged. And I think that's partly because of the attitude of government these days. The Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, I would say, has totally been captured by farming interests. Under Caroline Spellman, the last Secretary of State, she used to work as a researcher for the NFU. The ministers, you had Jim Pace, who was a dairy farmer, Richard Benyon, who's the richest MP in Parliament. He's worth about 110 million, but he owns vast swathes of the UK, and he even owns Grousemore. Now you've got David Heath, the farming minister, who was a pig farmer. Their minister in the Lords was a horticulturalist. And if you had any other department where it was so much dominated by people that have got a particular one-sided view of what food policy is all about, people would soon be sort of saying, well, this is, totally... how can they possibly be impartial on these issues, and there's something very wrong about this, but it doesn't seem to be challenged in the same way with DEFRA. And I think there's a few issues where we've seen that DEFRA has been really unwilling. So my computer keeps going on to needing the code putting in again, which is really annoying. But there's a few issues, I'd say with bees, badgers and buzzards. I'm just going to give a couple of examples of where they've, I would say, is of DEFRA being captured by vested interests. I don't know whether you've seen the campaign, I think it was led by Friends of the Earth, about the quite worrying decline in our bee populations. And I must admit, when I met with Friends of the Earth, I kind of thought bees were creatures that flew around and got pollen to make honey, and that was that was just what they did, and if you weren't interested in eating honey, then bees weren't particularly useful, and you just had to avoid being stung by them. I didn't realise that even things like cabbages are pollinated, and that they play an absolutely crucial role in the food chain. I think it's in Japan now, they're having to actually pollinate plants by hand because the bee population has died out. So imagine what that adds to the cost of producing food if you've got to go around and actually spread this pollen by hand because you've lost all your natural pollinators. And there's real concern that this is happening in the UK, and it's partly because of a decline of their natural habitats. People don't have gardens as much. A lot of the countryside isn't used for the same purposes that it was. But it's also, there's concern that neonicotinoid pesticides are endangering the bee population. And the EU was looking at a 2-year moratorium on the use of these pesticides. And of course the UK went along and said, we don't think the scientific evidence backed this up, and they voted against that 2-year ban. Fortunately, enough of the other European countries supported it for the 2-year ban to go through. But I think that was one example where it was, rather than looking at the overall picture, it was very much the farmers wanted to carry on being able to use these pesticides, and therefore that was DEFRA's position when they went into negotiations. The buzzards is another example, though, and this goes back to 2012, but as I said, Richard Benyon, the farming minister, owns a grouse moor, and yet he was going to commit, I think it was £375,000 of DEFRA money into a study to try to reduce the buzzard population. Because the buzzards, which are quite a rare species that are native to the UK, they were going around picking off the grouse, and so that people couldn't shoot the grouse. So there's something like 40 million game birds shot every year in this country, and I think about half of them are imported into this country just so that they can be shot. So there's just an industry of breeding game birds that you then let them fly off and people shoot them. I don't know whether you've seen you probably aren't Daily Mail readers, but particularly after the past week. But in the Mail on Sunday today, there's a picture of Pipa Middleton and her friends. So there's all these lovely Sloaney girls in their wellies and their glossy hair, and they've got about 50 game birds in front of them because they've just been on a shooting weekend. And I hope that there's quite a public outcry about it, because they look like your average hen weekend that have been for a fun night out, and yet they've got all these dead birds in front of them. As I said, there's this massive industry, 40 million birds being bred just so they can be shot, and yet the DEFRA minister thought that the threat to them was buzzards, so let's go up and study as to how we can curb the buzzard population so that people can be free to go and shoot these other birds that are flying around. So thankfully there was such an uproar about that the moment it became public that it was put a stop to. But I think it's indicative of where his thinking is. And then of course we know that with badgers, the badger cull, I'm a Bristol MP, so I'm kind of in the middle of the two zones, the Somerset and Gloucestershire zones, where we've had the pilot badger culls this summer. And I think you probably are all aware that scientific evidence is overwhelmingly against it just overwhelmingly shows that a badger cull would not be effective. I think at the very best they show that if the culling was carried out, if 70% of the badger population in a cull area was killed over a 10-year period, you might reduce bovine TB by 16%. There's no, again, if the focus wasn't so much on what farmers wanted, there would be a lot more attention by DEFRA to things like cattle-to-cattle transmission and some of the steps that farmers could take to reduce the transmission of TB within their own herds and when they take them to market to be sold. There would also be a lot more focus on vaccinations, and I really don't know why the Farming Union so clings to the idea of the cull as the only way of dealing with bovine TB. It just seems that all the evidence you look at is that vaccination is the way forward, plus some of these measures to stop the cattle-to-cattle transmission. It looks now like the culls, we probably could have predicted that they would be a failure, but the latest figures I saw this morning was that maybe about 800 badgers have been killed in Somerset and about 800 badgers in Gloucestershire. For the pilot culls to have been effective, they needed to kill, I think, about 2,500 in Somerset and even more than that, about 5,000 I think in Gloucestershire. And the reason why the figures are so vague is because they don't actually know how many badgers are in the pilot area to start with. So it's an entirely random process. We don't know how many badgers we've got, we don't know how many badgers we're going to have to kill, we don't know how many badgers we have killed, we don't know whether this will be effective, we don't know how many wounded badgers there are out there, and I've asked the government what sort of checks they would be carrying out on whether the badger cull was humane or not, and basically it's virtually nothing. There's going to be virtually no work at all going into that. They published a document after FOI requests showing what tests they would look at, what criteria they'd use, and it's just one black page after another because it's so heavily redacted. And now we've got a report that's been published that's got more information, but the whole thing is complete and utter shambles. But Owen Paterson, the new DEFRA secretary, basically wants to roll out the badger culls across the country, regardless of whether this is successful or not. So when Parliament returns on Tuesday, because we've been in recess for a few weeks, we're hoping to put an urgent question down, call Owen Paterson to the House to give his verdict on whether these pilot culls have been a success, and where we can challenge him and say, the other really worrying thing is people are now saying because they haven't managed to shoot as many badgers as they wanted to, is they're going to allow gassing instead, which is obviously pretty horrific. So we want to challenge them about that. We want to challenge them about the policing of the culls, the fact that it's been really expensive, and just raise again the public doesn't want this to happen. The scientists think that it's ludicrous. The petition, there was an e-petition on the Downing Street website that Dr. Brian May set up, and it's had over 300,000 signatures. It's more signatures than any other petition that we've ever had, and yet the government has ignored that. So that's something on the agenda for when we get back. One of the other instances where I'd say the government is, again, ignoring all the evidence in favour of it is about marine conservation. I don't know whether you've seen films like The End of the Line or Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall and his fish fight programme, there's the Blackfish organisation. There's really renewed focus now on the damage that's being caused to our marine environment, and particularly the damage that's caused by overfishing, and the fact that some fish stocks are just becoming incredibly rare, which obviously affects the whole food chain within the marine ecology. Towards the end of the last Labour government, we were looking at setting up marine conservation zones around the UK where there'd be different levels of restrictions, but in some there would be no fishing at all, and with others there would be restrictions on how much fishing there could be. There was this massive consultation, there was over 1 million stakeholders involved, and looking at the economic impact, the environmental impact, and it was agreed, and this new government agreed as well, there'd be 127 marine conservation zones around the UK. They've now rolled back on that completely, and it's because of pressure from the big commercial fishing fleets. There's only going to be 31, and even with that, they were going to introduce them this year, now they're going to off to next year. And again, I just think it shows that they're not concerned about the environmental impact. They're certainly not concerned about trying to reduce people's consumption of fish. It's just that you've got these huge trawlers, the huge fishing companies. They're actually putting the smaller fishermen out of business as well, and they've just caved into that totally. One of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is the environmental impact of the livestock sector and the environmental impact of eating meat. And you've seen, I'm sure, some of the reports that have come out in the press, probably every sort of few months or so, there's a report saying that actually one of the biggest causes of greenhouse gas emissions is the livestock sector. I think it's about 18% of greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to the livestock sector. There was a brilliant UN report going back to 2006 called Livestock's Long Shadow, which is really worth digging out. So a very authoritative report by the UN saying the livestock sector emerges as one of the top 2 or 3 most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale, from local to global. And you also had the IPCC, the International Committee on Climate Change, that said that if all families had just one meatless day a year, this would have the same beneficial effect on greenhouse gas emissions as taking 1 million cars off the road for an entire year. And yet this really isn't talked about very much. There was the Enough Food If campaign this year, and it was very worthy. It was meant to be the successor to Make Poverty History. And I was very supportive of it in that they were trying to tackle global hunger and put it on the political agenda. But they had all these reasons why people couldn't afford to feed themselves, and one of them was biofuels. And I sort of went to them, so it was all groups like Oxfam, all the big NGOs that were involved in developing country work and poverty reduction. And I went to them and said, why are you talking about biofuels when the figure for the amount of land that is being given up, so the deforestation and the sort of land grabs and so on that's associated with the livestock sector is about 8 times as high. So I think it's like the amount of land that's been given over to biofuels is something like 100 million, I'm just trying to find 100 million tonnes of crops were diverted to create biofuels in 2009, which is the last year for which you've got statistics. So that's 100 million tonnes for biofuels. 760 million tonnes of crops were used to feed animals. And yet, so surely that should have been part of their campaign as well. Biofuels is almost like a little bit of a red herring, but you couldn't get them to talk about the fact that the livestock sector is massively using our world's resources. It takes, they just whiz through the figures on that, it takes 100 times as much water to produce 1 kilogram of beef as it does 1 kilogram of vegetables. It takes 120 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of beef protein, as opposed to 2 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce a single calorie of plant protein. 21 square metres of land to produce 1 kilogram of beef. I can go on, and it's just a really inefficient use of the planet's resources in terms of land, in terms of fossil fuel energy, in terms of water. And it's Raj Patel, who's the author of this book called Stuffed and Starved, which is really good, he said the amount of grains fed to US livestock would be enough to feed 840 million people on a plant-based diet. And the number of food insecure people in the world is about 850 million. So again, we need to put this on the agenda. There's been one, I did a debate on it in Parliament in 2009, just because nobody else was talking about it, and I thought that somebody had to. We actually had another really weird debate on it this year, and as I said, there's been all sorts of authoritative reports from the IPCC, the WHO has reported on it, the UN. A lot of experts that have said the impact on climate change of the livestock sector is something we really have to address. There's an all-party group on beef and lamb, which is funded by the meat industry, and they decided that these reports weren't quite authoritative enough and comprehensive enough, so they would do their own reports. They spent 3 months looking into it, and surprise, surprise, they came out and said, actually, all these reports are nonsense. We don't have much of an impact on the environment at all, and you should stop picking on us. And it was a really strange debate. I went along because I'm a masochist, and there was about eight people that were all farmers, but MPs as well, in the debate, the farming minister and me. And I was the only one that challenged this report. And the report was entirely based on hill farming, so grass-fed cattle in the UK. And they said, well, which obviously doesn't have the same environmental footprint as cattle which is fed on grain and soya that's grown in the Brazilian rainforest or whatever. So it was entirely based on that. And to give him credit, David Heath did actually stand up and said, well, no, you're wrong, there is a lot of evidence that the livestock sector is responsible for this impact on the environment. But he also said, but we're not actually picking on you, because we don't tax you for your environmental impact. We're not doing anything. All we're doing is sort of raising it as an issue. But I think it's a sign of how defensive the farming lobby and the meat industry is, that we're prepared to fund this research. So in some ways it was, although the debate was very one-sided and that I was the only MP that had gone along there and said that they were talking nonsense, and I reeled off all these sort of other reports that had been published. The fact that they felt they had to commission that report and then they had to call this debate on it at least shows that the argument is getting through and they're worried about it, and they think that perhaps the government might act, so it was a preemptive strike by them. The other thing that has obviously also been a big issue this year was the horse meat scandal. I think that's just the last thing that I'll mention. I think that it obviously really worried people when it was revealed to them what was actually in the meat products that they were eating. And when I started looking at it, I was absolutely amazed that the figures for what actually is classed as meat is, under EU regulations, a product can be called meat if it's got at least 40% of anything that comes from an animal. So it's things like connective tissue, fat, all the scrapings. And I actually had quite a few colleagues coming up to me after I spoke to in a debate in Parliament saying that I made them feel incredibly sick and they weren't going to go and have their sausage sandwich in the tea room, which was what they planned to do, because you actually get these food plants where they're hosing down, trying to get pressure jets, get every last little bit of tissue, slime, scrapings, or whatever, off of this meat that is then turned into economy burgers. And I think, this is something, as I said, for something to be classed as a meat product, 40% of it has got to have some of these sort of disgusting bits and pieces in it. There was talk, the UK government was lobbying to get that reduced to 25%, so God knows what the other 75% would be. What we had in the debate, though, was some very well-meaning Tory MPs standing up and saying people need to learn to value their food more. So they ought to be buying locally sourced, organic meat from their local butchers, not the economy range, which is all very easy to say. But if you're a family that, we've seen 500,000 people now in the UK relying on food banks because they can't afford to feed their families. The cost of living is absolutely gone through the roof. People are being hit. I'm not going to give you a sort of party political lecture on the impacts of all the cuts and the welfare changes and pay freezes and all that, but we know that people's living standards are really being squeezed. And there's a market research company that said last year 30% of consumers now buy budget ranges as opposed to just 1 in 5 back in 2008 because they are so depressed. And if you're somebody that can barely make your money last to the end of the week and you can buy a pack of 8 burgers from Tesco's for £1, that's what you're going to do to feed your family. You're not going to save up and go to... I have no idea how much organic meat in a locally sourced sort of butcher's place costs, but you just can't afford to do that. It's a luxury for people. And what I think is really important is that people actually know what is in their food, and that's what the horse meat scandal did. Is it really shed a light on, and also the way the supply chains, the fact that these horses were coming from Ireland and there was some going over to Romania, and these products were being made in about 5 or 6 different countries. So at no stage in the process did you have an idea of what was being added to the products as well. And I think we really need to keep up the pressure on that. Lord Haskins, who's a farmer in the former chairman of Northern Foods, said that he thought there are many other scandals that could come to light. And most recently, I think I was told that there was an issue to do with cats being found in meat products as well. So you could say, I don't know how many of you are actually vegans, but you could say there's a bit of anthropology or whatever, if you're prepared to eat a cow, why are you worried about eating a horse, or why are you worried about eating a cat, or whatever. But the fact is that a lot of people were very worried about that, and we did see quite a rise. I think Fry's saw a real increase in their product sales, which is obviously good news. A few other things that we've been doing in terms of animal testing. I hosted an event in Parliament with the Dr. Hadwin Trust funding the first ever professorial post for the replacement of animal experiments with other scientific measures. So that's brilliant. So that's at Queen Mary's College in the University of London. And it just gives real academic credibility to the idea that there is an alternative to testing on animals. The government, again, is... One of the bits of good news we had was cosmetic testing on animals. The ban finally came in March this year. The government did commit, all the 3 main political parties committed in 2010 that the next step would be a ban on the testing of household products. And surprise, surprise, this government has it's not completely cold on the idea. It hasn't introduced the ban yet. Now what they're saying is they will introduce a ban on the testing of finished products on animals. But it's not the finished, in this country, the finished products aren't tested on animals, it's the ingredients that are tested. So there's a campaign that's going on at the moment saying you've had 3 years, you promised to do this, we want everyone to sign up. I think it's Cruelty-free International behind it. But that really is the next step, because there are plenty of household products out there that aren't tested on animals. You've got brands like M&S and Co-op, as well as Ecover and the other sort of slightly more obscure products. There's absolutely no need to test anything on cleaning products on animals, so I think that's the next step. I think that's it really, so open to any questions. I think you might want to come and speak into the mic, because there's a lot of background noise. Question was, what did the NGOs that were involved in Enough Food If say when I challenged them about livestock? They all kind of agreed with me. They said, yes, it's important we talk about that. But when we had the photo op for MPs, it was actually the Speaker's house in Parliament. So a lot of MPs came along. We had a choice of which card you could hold up. So there would be enough food if. And one of them was if we reduced biofuel consumption. And they didn't have a card for the livestock sector. So they kind of knew that it should be an argument, and I think it was just that they felt it was more difficult to sell to the public. Because biofuels were very popular with environmentalists about 10 years ago, and then suddenly people realised the downside to it. So now everybody knows that biofuels are an issue, but to actually challenge people's eating habits, they might think that that's getting a little bit too sensitive, which I think it would be easy to vegans to say, save the planet, go vegan, or go vegetarian at least. I think the real way to win over the public is things like the Meat-free Monday, and just sort of say to people, particularly people who aren't concerned about the ethical case for not eating animals, and haven't particularly taken on board the health case, which is obviously really significant and powerful as well. But people who want to do it for environmental reasons, if you could just sort of say, well, get your consumption down to 2 or 3 times a week, and don't eat too much fish either, because the seas are being overfished. That's definitely the way to go. Use and the livestock sector is the amount that's grown for cattle feed. So it would be huge swathes. So it's not the actual grazing or whatever the cattle is, it's the land that's used to grow their feed. And actually, Jim Pace, the former farming minister, several times in Parliament said it's all to feed vegetarians. So that all this soya is being grown to make veggie burgers, which is complete and utter nonsense. And God knows how many soya burgers he thinks that we actually consume, but that would be his line. It's all our fault, that we should stop eating our veggie burgers and drinking our soya milk. But in terms of the intensification and industrialisation, it is really worrying, because there's definitely moves towards it in the UK. I don't know if you're aware of the Lopton Dairy Farm campaign, where I think it's going to be 6,000 cows all crammed into it's almost just like sheds, and they're being indoors 23 hours of the day. In the US, they actually have multi-storey versions of it. They're milked far more than they would naturally be milked. There's a big pig farm at Foston in Derbyshire that was applying for planning permission as well. I think it's like about 26,000 pigs. So there's quite a few of these applications going through. And one of the problems with planning law is you can't reject a planning application on animal welfare grounds. You can only reject it on the impact on the local environment. So the Nocturne planning application was rejected on the grounds that they were worried there'd be a lot of seepage into the water supply of the sewage or whatever, that there'd be lorries coming and going. So you do it on those sort of grounds. You can't actually do it on the basis that you think that having these great big industrial farms is not a decent way of rearing animals. And these applications, some of them have gone back to the drawing board, but there's quite a few of those applications out there. And I think generally the public doesn't want this either. Even people who do drink milk or eat pigs or whatever, they don't want to think that the animals are being kept in those sort of conditions. So we just need to be very vigilant and campaign if that happens.
Hi Claire, sorry, I missed a lot of the start of the talk, so sorry if I asked something you already covered. But I just wanted to know, what do you think the chances are of the message is saying reducing your consumption of meat for environmental reasons or something like that being taken up at quite high political levels, say almost like a party leader or someone in the cabinet comes this and that. I asked because I did ask Nick Clegg, one of these open kind of talk thing ons about this, and he made a gag to start off with, obviously. But then he came around and said, actually, no, you make a very good point, and I think with certain types of meat it's very serious yesterday when I was consumption. So clothes, setting and everything, he took on the point is serious, but I wonder whether you think there's a chance of any people coming out and taking issue on it.
I don't know if you caught that, people saying there's any chance of any party leader coming out and supporting the arguments for reducing meat consumption. And I think the short answer is no. And I think they all know that they should. There was actually, the International Development Select Committee did a report about it very recently about how you could feed the world if people ate less meat. And obviously in developing countries there's a shift towards people eating more meat as they get lifted out of poverty, which isn't the best use of the resources of that country. And so I've been trying to persuade Ivan Lewis, who's our Shadow International Development Secretary, to take that on board. So it's filtered through enough into the mainstream and it's been reported in the press enough for people to know that they can't rubbish it. But people just get very nervous. It's similar to the sort of debates about drinking, isn't it? Things like minimum alcohol pricing. People get very nervous about being seen to tell people what they can and can't do. So I think it's partly about making sure there's as much information as possible out there, but it does need a bit of bravery of people to set an example by just saying, well, I've gone down to eating meat 3 days a week or whatever. And Bill Clinton's gone virtually vegan. I think he eats a tiny little bit of fish once a week, but he's done that for health reasons. Bill Gates has gone vegan, and that's more in relation to the development side of things. So if you've got really people with incredible reach and powerful voices doing that, then we maybe can hope that some politicians will follow.
Thank you for the talk. You mentioned that someone had told me that the consumption of soya was mainly due to vegetarian. I went to the last talk by Justin Kurzweil from Pipa, and he pointed out that 97% of soya production actually goes to feed the cattle that are eaten by vegans. But I think the point on statistics is good. We do have to be careful of these statistics. For example, the statistic about greenhouse gas emissions that you mentioned, 18% coming from livestock farming. I've often used that in arguments, and I've done a bit of volunteering for Friends of the Earth, and I always get people disputing that and saying there are different studies and so forth. And actually, the last speaker was saying that the UN has actually revised that figure as well now, down to 14.5%, which is still a huge amount, and your point's still valid. But I just thought I'd mention that in case people get any sort of debates or anything, just be aware they might want to be a bit careful with that 18% figure. It's probably 14%.
That's the 18% was from, I think, livestock's long shadow. I think that's where it came from. So now I didn't realise they revised it downwards, but yeah, you are right that is the problem with. You'll be seized on it if you get any facts slightly wrong. But the 97% of soya going towards animal feed, I didn't realise that figure existed, and presumably the other 3% isn't all veggie burgers either. So I should go back to and tell June Pace. I was actually in Mozambique with June Pace the day the badger cull started. I was on this parliamentary delegation, and you can imagine. So we were all going out to South Africa for this Commonwealth conference, but then we split into small groups. There were 3 MPs going to Mozambique, and when I realised it was going to be me and June Pace, and so I said to the other colleague, whatever you do, don't mention badgers, because we've just been at war for 3 years about badgers, and we were doing really really well being terribly polite to each other, even though I publicly said I thought he was the worst farming minister we'd ever had, but we were being very polite. And then Sarah, the other MP, came down to breakfast one morning and said, I'm getting so many emails about bloody badgers. And me and Jim were like, heads down, don't talk about the badgers. And I have to say, actually, I did this speech in Johannesburg about human rights in the Commonwealth, and there was a very controversial passage in it about LGBT rights. And then when it was opened up to all the audience discussion, I got a really hard time from some countries who think that protecting the rights of homosexuals isn't a human right at all, and that religious beliefs and so on, and introducing the death penalty for gays is a perfectly nice thing to do. And Jim Pace came to my defence and did this wonderful off-the-cuff speech about how he believed in equality for everybody. And so we almost made friends, but then I remembered the badgers, and you remember he said he likes gays, doesn't like badgers much, but there you go, I digress.
Thanks for being vegan, thanks for being here, and thanks for being in Parliament. There's 2 points I'll the one I know least about first, so I'll remember to say. It's the something on Tuesday. I heard by Facebook that there's going to be some sort of bill that would make campaigners have even fewer rights than they do now. So it'd be lovely if you could tell us about that. And then the second thing is about the biofuels. I think what's particularly important to me is that this is the whole new area of increasing violence on the eco-side, as you know, about palm oil and biomass. So I'm glad it was on the IFS agenda, I was there too. As you probably are aware, with the station and the power station in Bristol that's just got the go-ahead, the government, far from understanding about biofuels, they've actually passed a bill the last few months which is calling palm oil and biomass renewable energies. They're now sources of renewable energies. Even we're talking about the mass ecocide in Malaysia and Indonesia, etc. And actually all around the world with biomass. So that I'd like to ask you about, and because that's gone through now, and that will be paid for by renewable energy. Subsidies from our electricity bills are actually going to pay for this ecocide. So it's those 2 points. Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, I think you're very right, and it is worrying. Again, it goes back to this thing about planning permission, that you can't reject the Avonmouth biofuels plant. They can only object to it on local environmental grounds. They can object to it on the fact that it might destroy the rainforest. And Ed Miliband was, when he was climate change secretary, so just before the 2010 election, he was actually quite sympathetic to the idea of trying to change the rules so that you could object to things because you didn't like the underlying purpose of them. You didn't want to encourage this sort of thing going on. I don't know where we are with it actually as a party now in terms of whether we would be pushing for that or what we would do on the classification as renewables. But I obviously need to go away and find out about that. And remind me what your first point again was about the bill. Yeah, the lobbying bill. There's this bill going through Parliament at the moment, and it was kind of rushed through. We came back for 2 weeks after the summer recess. We were just sitting for 2 weeks, and we had about 4 days debate on the floor of the House of this. It's known as the gagging bill on social media, but it's partly designed to stop the trade unions doing political campaigning. So it's restrictions on third-party spend in campaign activity. What has happened is it's actually caught an awful lot of other organisations in as well. So I think the government was thinking, they don't like the League Against Cruel Sport campaigning because obviously their campaign against hunting, a lot of Tory MPs support hunting. So it was trying to stop some of that as well, them spending lots of money, say, on billboards or whatever, going into a general election. What it's actually done is managed to unite virtually every charity you can think of. So the Salvation Army is opposing this bill, British Legion's opposing this bill, just everybody, because they realised it will curb their freedom of speech. And it's very worrying, and the government realised that there was this huge groundswell of opinion against it, and I've had hundreds of emails. So they're meant to be bringing back amendments to the bill on Tuesday. And I haven't studied the amendments yet, but now everyone is saying that the amendments don't go far enough, they're not good enough. And the whole bill is just like, it was seconded in the House of Lords. So I think there's a pretty good chance that we can defeat it. But you need to keep up the public pressure and all emailing your MPs. It was interesting actually. There was a debate in Westminster Hall maybe about 6 months ago about the RSPCA, and it was called by the guy that used to be chair of the Countryside Alliance, and that was about the RSPCA bringing prosecutions for animal cruelty. And they were trying to stop the RSPCA doing it, saying it's the police's job to bring prosecutions, the RSPCA shouldn't do this. And they were speaking on behalf of RSPCA members, and members wouldn't want them to bring prosecutions. Well, if you're an RSPCA member, you can always stop being a member if you don't like what the RSPCA is doing. What was bizarre about this debate is nobody mentioned fox hunting. And that's what it was about. It was because things like the hate frog hunt had been prosecuted by the RSPCA. There's been about 380, I think, prosecutions under the Hunting Act since it was brought in. But the people who support fox hunting want to perpetuate this idea that the Hunting Act isn't enforceable, and you may as well scrap it because it's not, it doesn't have any effect. And so that's why they were getting at the RSPCA. And it was one of the most hostile debates I'd ever been in Parliament, with all these people just attacking the RSPCA for basically doing its job. But the bizarre thing was they didn't want to be portrayed as being pro-fox hunters, so they didn't mention hunting. And it was only when the Labour people got up and said, come on, this is about fox hunting, and it's because I think Cameron's father-in-law's hunt was actually one of the ones that was prosecuted. But that's the sort of thing that they would want to be targeting with this legislation, is people speaking out on issues. Basically, third-party spend would be when you're not saying vote Labour, vote Tory, vote for thing. It would just be saying vote against the people who support fox hunting or something like that, and it would curb that. So obviously we're going to do our best to try and defeat it, but we've only won, I say we as the opposition, we've only won one vote in Parliament in the last 3 years, and that was on the Syria military intervention, which was obviously a really great moment. In House of Lords, I think they've won 69 votes. They've defeated the government 69 times since the election, and that's because we've got a lot of crossbench peers, and it's not as the whipping system. You've got just a lot more independent-minded people in the House of Lords. So even if we can't defeat it in the Commons, gets the House of Lords, particularly they've got a lot of lawyers there. I think they're on political shreds. Look at the impact on that. So I don't think it's like a strict rule. It will just be in the same way that if you were looking at, say, a supermarket being built in a town centre, there wouldn't be strict rules as to whether it would have a particular impact on traffic flows or air pollution or whatever, but you would just look over the impact and then make a decision whether, on the balance, it was a good thing or a bad thing. But I do think that we need to, that is one element. So it's a bit of NIMBYism actually, the villagers in this sort of nice area didn't want it polluted in that sort of way. But I think we've still got to get across that argument about Jim Pace would have said that these animals are being really well looked after, but he talks about cows as being units of production. So it's to increase the efficiency of the units of production. So that means that if you keep them in this intensive farms, you can milk them 3 or 4 times a day instead of the 2 times a day that you would if they were out in the fields. And I had this bizarre conversation with a Tory MP recently. We were in Sri Lanka, and there'd obviously been that civil war for about 20 years in Sri Lanka. And someone mentioned something about cows had just been left to go wild for like 3 years or so, and eventually be returned to their villages. And he said, well, that couldn't happen because if they were just roaming around, there would be no one to milk them, and their udders would have burst. And I said, no, Jonathan. And he was actually Justice Minister. He's a lawyer. He's made millions from being a lawyer. And I said, no, if they were just off doing their own thing, they wouldn't be producing milk all the time unless they had a calf there to drink the milk. And he says, no, don't be silly. Cows have to be milked twice a day. And I was like, no, they really don't. And to be honest, I became a vegan when I was, I think, 27. And I I thought cows just produce milk in the same way that birds fly and dogs bark or whatever like that. And I didn't realise it was anything to do with being pregnant and having to feed your baby in the same way that women, breastfeed. So I think there's some of these sort of really basic arguments that you get across. I think one of the most powerful ones is we are the only species that drinks milk after weaning. Everyone else stops when they get to about a year old or whatever. We are the only ones that carry on drinking the milk of an animal, and some of the health consequences that flow from that. So sometimes you have to go back to the really, really basic points. You have to explain things to people that you might have thought was really obvious.
I was just wondering if there were any things that you, the other part of the MPs, were going to say about educating themselves about English issues.
That was about schools, education in schools about issues. I think some of the groups do go into, I think Viva goes into schools. I think there's a few groups that send people into schools to actually sort of talk during, the citizenship classes have all been totally reduced down to virtually nothing these days, particularly with the sort of Cantonese and free schools. But I think it's important, and if it's taught in, particularly with some of the health issues around it as well. I was talking to somebody earlier that was saying if free school meals are introduced, to what extent will that allow for vegetarian vegan diets? And I think it's really important they do it. The same in prisons and in hospitals, that push to make sure that people get it. I was involved in the Pussy Riot case, and one of the members of Pussy Riot is they're obviously in penal colonies in Russia, and one of them is vegan. And Alicia Silverstone wrote this slightly, it was very much a sort of Hollywood lovey type letter to Putin, but it was basically saying that it was really important that Marsha had a vegan diet while she was in a penal colony, and everyone sort of ridiculed her, saying, if she's in a penal colony, the last thing she's going to worry about is whether she gets a vegan food. Whereas actually, that's completely misunderstanding what it's like to be vegetarian or vegan. That would be a major part of the hardship of being in there if you were being forced to eat meat. Not to mention the fact that it would probably make you very ill. And it comes back to this whole idea that it's kind of like people see it as a lifestyle choice, it's a fad that you choose to adopt. And I think that sort of filters through into things like the provision of school meals and hospitals and stuff like that. People do feel that it's, you're just being a little bit self-indulgent, and if it's difficult for them to provide it, then you ought to just sort of accept the other options that are available. And it is maybe it's going a bit over the top to say it's a human right to be able to choose what you want to eat, but it kind of is. It's important. If people have got the right to choose what religion they practice, I don't think there's any difference between that and the sort of ethical belief that goes with veganism. And I think you can have some interesting test cases if schools weren't actually providing the information, providing the meals in particular for vegetarian vegan kids. Practical advice for lobbying your MP. You've got these websites now like 38 Degrees and Avaz, which are really good in that they will sort of send you issues, and I can always tell when they've launched a new campaign because suddenly I start getting lots and lots of emails on it. Some MPs will ignore those mass-produced emails and then ignore signatures on petitions and then ignore postcards as well, so they'll only pay attention to individual letters. I don't, I reply to all of them, and apart from anything else, it's just a really good way of communicating with hundreds of constituents all at the same time, and you only need to draft one reply, but you can send it out to hundreds of people. So signing up to those organisations, but also then trying to say to them, can you run a campaign on these things and mobilise people to do it. But then just firing off emails to MPs, if you read a report in the paper or if you see that something's coming up, like the lobbying bill, and just, you can drop a 3-line email to MP and say, can you tell me what your position is on this? Can you tell me what you've, have you read this report? Or will you ask a question about it? Will you sign an early day motion in Parliament? But online, I think really, there's a lot of MPs. I think the majority of MPs are on Twitter now, so that's a pretty good way of contacting them as well. Or you can ask them to go along and see them at their surgery if you really feel strongly about it. Take a group of people along to talk to them about it.
I just wondered whether you know about subsidies to animals in relation to livestock, either at European level or UK, and whether it's ever possible in the future to tax on meat consumption, say on environmental grounds.
It's one of the strange things about the approach to farming in this country is that there's generally this policy that businesses fall or stand on their own merits. So you had, when at the beginning of the coalition government, there was this big row going on about Ford Monsters in Sheffield, which basically needed a loan from the government to ensure it's viable and to win new contracts. And all it needed was temporary assistance from the government. It was commercially viable, but the government, and it was Vince Cable's department, and it was in Nick Clay's constituency, I think, or very close to it. Vince Cable said, no, it's all down to the market, and this company's got to fall or stand on its own merits. You get to agriculture, and it's completely the opposite. It's so heavily subsidised. And when people say to me, farmers, it costs more to produce a pint of milk than they can get selling it. To me, the argument would be, well, move into something that makes more money then, and which maybe I would say that. I actually found out the other day that some Welsh hill farmers, the sheep farmers, are moving into growing blueberries instead. Blueberries are massively expensive, so you can see there's like a real market for blueberries. And they can make far more money growing blueberries than they can sort of with the sheep on the hills, which seems to be like an argument for more blueberries. But I do think the Common Agricultural Policy needs substantial reform. It's up for review at the moment. It's an absolute nightmare trying to unpick it, particularly because you've now got all the extra European countries, and some of those have got very big agricultural sectors. But I would like there's meant to be a shift towards, there's Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 in the Common Agricultural Policy, and there's meant to be a shift towards subsidies for doing environmental good. But as I understand it, that's not really working very well. So yeah, I would like to see subsidies used more to protect the environment than to sort of subsidise farming. I met this Swedish MP a few years ago, and he was actually introducing a bill in the Swedish Parliament called the Reduction of Meat Consumption Bill. And I think that was talking about some sort of tax involved in that. And I could just imagine the uproar if we tried to do something similar. And it was only a private member's bill, it didn't go anywhere. But it would be quite good fun if somebody did that in the UK Parliament, but it's probably quite important it's not one of the vegans. It needs to be. There was a bill about the livestock sector, a private member's bill, that Friends of the Earth supported a few years ago. It was blocked by the government. But that was Rob Flello, the MP for Stoke-on-Trent. And he sort of he stood up and said, he's quite a big guy, and he said, I have a bacon sandwich every morning for breakfast, so I'm not coming at this from the mad vegan angle. And I think sometimes it carries a bit more credibility than if it looks like us just sort of waving the vegan banner.
Well, one thing I don't really understand is that, hardwoods, because quite a while ago hardwoods were made illegal in this country, isn't it? And ivory is made illegal, and so on. But why then are governments now actually not only supporting ecocides, but actually paying it for us with subsidies from our money? I'm talking about, the electricity bills. Part of our electricity bills is now going to support ecocide in Malaysia and Indonesia for this palm oil to be brought over here. And I just don't get it. Why has it gone from sensible decisions like hardwood to actually promoting it? I don't get it.
I think it's just that the argument hasn't been won yet. So with the illegal logging of timber and things like that, it took quite a long time for legislation legislation and parliamentary action to catch up with the growing evidence. And with palm oils, it's I think we're just not there yet on biofuels, and it's particularly. The problem is because it has got this, it's seen as renewable, and now you say it's classified as renewable. There are a lot of people that are sort of still have it categorised as that in their head, so they're not making the connection. They're just thinking, it's an alternative between that, say, nuclear power or fossil fuels or whatever. So it just needs you to carry on making the case, really. It's sort of slightly outside the scope of sort of about the veganism thing, but I just think people haven't. I agree that it's having a really significant environmental impact in a lot of countries, and it's something that we ought to be. We definitely should be encouraging in this country, whether it's through the tax system or elsewhere. This will be the last one. 2 years ago, the French government outlawed vegetarian meals in schools, and I was wondering if you had any advice or anything with regards to campaigning. And they did. Did you? What can the campaigners in the UK do? I didn't realise that. You were saying that 2 years ago the French government outlawed vegetarian meals in schools, which I know French people, they kind of hate vegetarians, don't they? Or is it they've seen the film Green Card with Gerard Depardieu, and when he finds out Andy McDowell's a vegetarian, or a boyfriend's a vegetarian, I think he's sort of really unimpressed. But I think it was interesting, the Commission for Equality and Human Rights actually looked at, they were trying to sort of look at the boundaries of human rights law and to sort of test where ethical belief came into it, as opposed to religious belief. And they were going to use veganism as an example, a sort of test study. And then they decided not to do it, and they said it was because it was so obviously it was something that would fall under that categorisation, where there was other things that, perhaps a bit more off-the-wall beliefs that wouldn't be classed as that. So I think that sort of indicates that you would have a good case for the European Court of Human Rights if you weren't. I suppose so. It's your right to a free school meal. I suppose if you've got the alternative of bringing your own food, you could say, well, you're not being denied your right to eat.